whom some of you know, many of you might not, once rebuked a UNC stalwart who she considered to have made an obscene proposal, namely that Indo-Trinidadians should be given equal status, should be allowed to enjoy equal status in the public sector. In her view, Afro-Trinidadians should be allowed to enjoy hegemonic status in the public sector, and for a lot of reasons which were similar, Indo-Trinidadians and the other minorities should be allowed to exercise, to continue to exercise hegemonic status. And she said that if there was any attempt to radically interfere with that concordat, if you wish, that compact, if you wish, that all kinds of difficulties could arise in society. So, in terms of her formula, which we will call Model 1, it was a way of dealing with a very difficult problem, one that could lead to a destabilization of the society. Then there was Model 2, which we embraced formally at independence. That is, we said that in this society, every reed race find an equal place, and that the system, the bureaucratic system, should be so structured to reflect this constitutional imperative, this belief, this requirement that somehow the allocation of public resources should be done on the basis of equality. So we have these two models, and my judgment is that, notwithstanding what obtained in terms of the formal constitutional position, that what we had in practice under Dr. Williams and his successors was in fact Model 1. The formal arrangement was Model 2, but the one that was in practice, which prevailed in practice, was Model 1. That is, we should allow that arrangement which we inherited over the years to stand. Well, there are a lot of people who were strongly opposed to this arrangement, none more so than my friend and colleague, Mr. Pandey, who from the moment of his entry into politics raised questions about this order. And it was in an attempt to respond to what Mr. Pandey was saying that the Center for Ethnic Studies was established. I don't know whether he knows that, but Mr. Manning in 1991 was of the view that Mr. Pandey was exaggerating his complaints about the dominance or the lack of representativeness in the public sector of Indo-Trinidadians. And Mr. Manning's view that if the matter was studied in a clinical way, that much of what was being said by Pandey and Rambugan and others would be found to be basically untrue. So the center was established, and this was one of several exercises which were undertaken. But first, what I want to do is to briefly summarize some of the findings of the report, of the study, in respect of the public sector, and then go on to talk a little more about what we found in respect of the private sector. Broadly speaking, the report identified major imbalances in the political and bureaucratic system. And there is no way that one could disguise the fact that particularly at the upper levels of the public service, the public enterprises, the municipal boards, etc., you had a dominance of Afro-Trinidadians. Also in the protective services, the fire services, the army stood out. In the defense force, this was also the case. It was less so in the Coast Guard. It was less so in the clerical and middle ranges of the public service, where if we look at the figures, we will see that there was a fair degree of representativeness, although there were imbalances. There were certain parts of the central public services where these discrepancies were glaring. One area where we were particularly concerned, about, was in the health services, where the report talks about a state of siege that was perceived by some of the people who worked in those establishments. You had a situation where most of your doctors, not all, but about 54% of your doctors were Indians, and equivalent numbers of nurses were Afro-Trinidadians. And there was a lot of tension and disquiet, and there were all kinds of allegations about who was doing what, to whom, for what reasons, etc. So basically, and I think we will hear more about that from others, we did find that particularly at the upper levels of the public service, the public enterprises, boards, etc., Indo-Trinidadians was significantly underrepresented, in some cases unrepresented, but that the one area that I recall where there seemed to be some measure of equity was in the clerical grades of the public service and ranges 35 to about 45, where because of the competitive nature of the entry arrangements, Indo-Trinidadians had begun to do very well, and in some cases they even exceeded what would be defined as an optimum. In the main, we found that there were significant imbalances in the private sector. Most of the firms in the sector were sole proprietorships, family businesses, etc. And the recruitment to these businesses tended to be ascriptive, determined mainly by family, extended and otherwise kin. There was a disposition to employ co-ethnics, co-religionists, and there were a number of establishments in which there were establishments owned by Indo-Trinidadians where there were few or no Afro-Trinidadians. Most owners justified their recruitment practices on the basis of myths and stereotypes which were current in the society. We were told by some that Indo-Trinidadians were more reliable, more punctual, more conscientious, more trustworthy, etc., etc., and that they were recruited not because of race, but for other assumed characteristics which they were said to have. In firms which were owned by Indo-Trinidadians, as I said, there were many of them that where one found no person, particularly at the managerial level and the professional level, there were invariably co-ethnics. No one of Afro-Trinidadian descent was employed in the managerial level in 88.2% of the Indian-owned firms, 92.5% of Chinese-owned firms, 81% of Syrian-owned firms, and 76% of white-owned firms. Interestingly, however, this behavior, this tendency to recruit family was not exclusive to the Indian community. There is an assumption that all the firms are owned by Indo-Trinidadians and no firms were owned, or very few were owned by Afro-Trinidadians. That was not borne out by our analysis. In fact, the figures I have are that 39.9% of the firms in the sample, and the sample was scientifically drawn, 39.9% of the firms were Indo-Trinidadian firms, and 25% of the firms were owned by Afro-Trinidadians, and then you have mixtures, etc., etc. The behavior in the firms that were owned by Africans was more or less the same, except that the numbers were a little different. In other words, whereas in firms owned by Indo-Trinidadians, you had 80-something% without any kind of ethnic representation by Indos and others. In the case of the Afro-Trinidadian owned firms, the numbers were slightly different. And a consciousness of kind was also evident in firms owned by Afro-Trinidadians. Indo-Trinidadians were not to be found in 78.7% of these firms, and in 75% of firms owned by Syrian, Lebanese, and whites. Given the history of how the two major conglomerates were formed, it was not surprising to find that ethnic predominance was also evidenced. 69% of their employees, that's in the two conglomerates, 69% of their employees were white, off-white, or mixed. 15% were Indo-Trinidadian, 14% were Afro-Trinidadians, and 7% were Chinese. It's perhaps worth mentioning or noting that most firms recruited on the basis of recommendations made by family members or friends, with the remainder relying on advertisements, etc., etc. So the question then is, at the end of the exercise, at the end of the day, what does one do about the situation in the private sector? These were businesses with histories, family histories. These were businesses which were located in ethnic enclaves. Let me just read one paragraph from the report, which I think most of the recruiting decisions was seen to be part of a group struggle. Many owners believe that in choosing to recruit co-ethnics, they enhance the prestige and status of the group as a whole in relation to other groups. To quote the report more specifically, the fewer of them who are seen to be economically marginal or stigmatized, the higher the status of the group. The greater the number who are seen to be economically successful, the greater the tendency on the part of the wider society to regard them as objects of envy or worthy of emulation. The desire for group pride and hegemony is thus a strong motivating force informing the practice of co-ethnic recruitment. In sum, ethnicity in economics is driven by the same considerations that apply to ethnicity in politics.